Hello, everyone. I'm Tiff Baldwood. I'm the Managing Director of Australian Genomics, and welcome to DNA Dialogue, the seminar series where we share new developments in health genomics and hear from international leaders in the field. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. I'm joining you from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to First Nations people who are joining us today. Please ask any questions using the Q&A function during the presentation, and I'll try and get through as many of the questions as I can at the end during question time. So I would like to welcome Rodney Haring to present to us today. Dr. Rodney Haring is the inaugural chair of the Roswell Park Department of Indigenous Cancer Health in Buffalo, New York, and is a past fellow at the National Congress of American Indians and the Mayo Clinic. He's a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians and the Beaver Clan and resides on the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation. Rodney has a doctoral degree in social work and considerable practice experience in this field. He's served on the US DHHS American Indian and Alaskan Native Health Research Advisory Council, which works with tribal leaders to set priorities and make recommendations as to Native health programs and policies. His research interests centre around eliminating disparities and encouraging resilience within Indigenous communities. So today, Rodney will be speaking to us about activities sort of as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, where many Indigenous nations contracted with commercial entities and other organisations for diagnostic testing and vaccine development. And in this process contributed biological samples and often broadly consented for indefinite use for future genomics research. So Rodney will be sharing with us the challenges of navigating ongoing data use in these Indigenous cohorts and how community-approved contractual protections were put in place. Rodney, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to sharing more about our work from the U.S. side of things and amongst our sovereign nations across the U.S. and Canada as well. So thank you. I'm going to pull up my slides here. Excellent. And begin sharing those. So my name is Rodney Haring, and as mentioned, I'm from the Seneca Nation, which is part of the Haudenosaunee of the Iroquois or the Iroquois Confederacy. Located in New York. Our nation's ancestral territories and areas spanned also into Canada, what is now known as Ontario and Quebec, all across New York, and then also into the state of Pennsylvania. Land acknowledgements, thank you for sharing that at the beginning. I want to share a little bit about our new Department of Indigenous Cancer Health, which is the first department of Indigenous Cancer Health at any NCI designated cancer center across the United States. This initiated not too long ago, a few weeks ago, but we had working as a center in the areas of both research and service back into the community for the past few years. And I've been at Roswell Park for just about a decade or so. But our mission for this type of work, both in our center capacity and as a department, is based on our mission to work with our communities in the context of one, behavioral and prevention interventions. Secondly, in the area of what does the environment mean to our people in relationship to different types of cancer, and lastly, education for our younger generations and what that means to create a pathway for our younger generations into the cancer scientists, our next generation of cancer scientists, and collectively working together to achieve those goals. Part of that is what I'll be discussing today in relation to data user agreements, sovereignty, kind of the premise of sovereignty and what that means. But first, I'll start off by sharing. You see this image and this picture here of 5 arrows bundled. And then in the background of that, behind the arrows, are representation of our Haudenosaunee nations and what we would call a wampum belt or a wampum agreement between our tribes, tribal governance early in the U.S. history, with that of the United States and also of Canada. Those 5 blocks in the back are representation of our original 5 nations, and later in history we had a 6th nation join us, the Tuscaroras. And in the middle, you'll see the Tree of Peace. And the representation there of that symbolism, which we recall in our history and bring it forward into things that we do today, is how at an early history, our history as Native nations, we were often in conflict with each other, battling, having wars, and we needed to find a way to create peace in the things that we were doing that wasn't really healthy for our people. And a person came from the Huron Nation and brought a message to our people about creating peace amongst each other. And he was known as the Peacemaker. And the Peacemaker came across the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and one by one spread this word of kind of understanding peaceful relationships and what that means. And eventually, through those discussions, our people became more peaceful and gained a lot of strength in what we did. The representation of those arrows also represent that. And it was asked for one of the warriors to come up and say, "Hey, can you break this arrow?" And we know you're a strong warrior. He grabbed the arrow and, of course, broke the arrow. And then he was asked to come up again, and 5 arrows were bundled together with a piece of leather, and he was asked to break that, and he couldn't break it. And that symbolism really talks about how we back in early history, how we put our nations together in a confederacy type framework to stand in strength, peace, and harmony. And I translate that into the work that we do within our communities and within our nations, that oftentimes when we are talking about data, or we're talking about research, or talking about service provisions for our communities, sometimes when we're grant writing or other means, being a faculty member, there are challenges and things that are based in kind of a non-collectivist type of manner, where we're putting against each other to compete. But at the same time, in our communities, we're taught to be collective and have a healthy mindset working together. So I always have to remember that when we enter into relationships, whether it be data conversations, whether it be research, whether it be service to the people, that we keep that in mind as I talk about, go through the presentation today, that we have to remind ourselves that we need to work together collectively towards strength, peace, and harmony. And part of that is also knowing your landscape. And here you'll see Indian country, so to say, and NCI designated cancer centers across the United States. And the first part are just the purple areas are Native American tribal lands that are federally recognized in the United States. The yellow dots are the comprehensive cancer centers. And you'll see some, we did this spatial map to kind of look at where do we need more conversation about cancer care in the US, and how do we find data to work towards that, towards finding out the gaps, understanding the resiliencies, and putting that in action towards service provisions in our communities. So knowing your landscape is really important to understand as you kind of move forward with any type of project. The Indian Health Service in the United States is broken down into kind of quadrants across the US. So even though understanding your larger landscape, but then also understanding your regional landscape of the different areas for the US, and in Canada, we go by territories, a reservation, and reserve. And I know in Australia, it's more of a country approach. So understanding your kind of country landscape, both nationally and regionally, is really important when you start to think about creating data, understanding data, protecting data in your respective landscapes. And we break it down even further. For our tribes, or in our country, part of the US, where this is the image of New York State, those darker shaded purple areas are where our territories or pieces of our country are that are ancestrally related. And that was kind of some of the focus to understand the data in our particular communities. Is important to understand where we need to put our efforts into finding better means of health, celebrating projects or clinics that are doing really good things in our communities, and finding how we can move things forward. and just a couple images of our landscape across the Haudenosaunee and Seneca landscapes here in the winter, and then the summer, and then in the springtime. So as we move forward and talk about data, it's also very important to understand Indigenous research codes and the history and respective communities. So I just laid a general framework here to start understanding and learning about how to frame that to use in the work that you might do. And one is to know your country's current research review protocol, if your area has one. If not, to learn about research projects that have occurred successfully in collaboration with the Indigenous people in your area and what that experience has been like. So learn the history and evolution and change and amendments. So even understanding where the research protocol is in its current state, but also learn about the previous research protocol and what has been changed or amended over time to make it where it's at, to learn about all the history of all these different research processes and what it means to that particular part of the country. Number three, be familiar with neighboring countries and areas and what their experience has also been, and how you can work together. I think that's really important if an Indigenous area next to you or adjacent to you has had a good process and good experience with their research process, to learn from your neighbor about how they've interacted with other parliament or other parts of the governance in your region, and what that's looked like through either the university or through Cancer Center. Learn more about Indian Health Services, and this would be your kind of government to country relationships in the area of healthcare and what that means to data and research. And then also know the IRBs either in your area, part of the country, or nationally, and how they have interacted with research that's occurring in your particular landscape. And then also number five, learn more about different organizations, and again, the history of the tribal review. And six, make informed decisions on how to partner for research review on those first five concepts. Options for tribes or parts of your country, again, is to understand your area offices, whether they have a research review process, whether they have a more national approach, and working nation to nation or country to country and part of your landscapes, and what's worked and what hasn't worked. But also take into consideration working with either other colleges, university partners, or other areas that have an IRB, other organizations that have an IRB that have worked respectfully in the communities that you intend to work with is really important. So it isn't really about when you start talking about I'm starting to talk here about IRBs, is to really learn that landscape and how that particular IRB has understood or understand the history of research and the current state of the research and where the research is going, and the protections around IRB. There's a number of IRBs across in any country that either have little to no experience, and there are others that have a lot of experience. And it's really finding that respectful partnership, and also being open to working with those that are open-minded to learn more about working with Indigenous data. I also put this in there, tips for sustainability. So if you've had an IRB that you're working with, and then it has a friendly, and make sure that the IRB protocols are friendly in nature, so that when the government changes in our respective regions, whether it's tribal and country government or relationships to the parliament, that each administration has something that can be handed to the next administration, so that the fluidity of either whether it be institutional review board review process or data user agreements are part of that exchange from one administration to another, to honor community voices and professional in the respective communities and their efforts towards IRBs. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about data user agreements in a minute here, but to honor those that come from the community to be part of that process. Ensure that any advisory boards that are working with the IRB or research protocols are knowledgeable about the tribal context and infrastructures that they're working in, that they're not perhaps from all over the country land, different country parts, or just national, that at least some of the board have explicit knowledge and on the ground knowledge of the research process in that particular community is important, and integrate review process into longstanding existing department structures, meaning that if you have an institution review board that you're working with, and if there's other departments, committees, or areas within that tribe or country that are working well, to engage them as a longstanding community partner that has had experience working that particular landscape. And then and this is the part where I shift to talk a little bit more about data user agreements and what that means in Indigenous landscapes. And I think for many institutions or tribal governments or Indigenous governments or area or country that are working with parliament structures, that the IRB is great, and it's part of it is part of scientific process. But what I see more and more is the use and conversations around data agreements or DUAs. And we've seen that in the United States, for example, with the National Institutes of Health requiring a data use section in the grants now, and what that means for not only the communities that you're working with, but how to protect data and putting it right into the grant and kind of weaving it throughout the grant process. And when you're working with tribes, it becomes a little more complex and it becomes a little more detailed, and it's important to have those nuances in there. But before I get into that, I'm going to share a little story. With many Indigenous populations, storytelling is part of how we share kind of generational knowledge and from the beginning of time knowledge. And our stories of the Haudenosaunee are likely similar to the stories or practice of dreaming on the Aboriginal people of Australia. So I'll share the story first and kind of what that means to the Haudenosaunee, and then I'll relate the story and what it means to the practice of data user agreements and research. And the story is about how the Jide'o got their songs, and Jide'o in Seneca means birds. So every so often, our creator comes down to take a look at the things that was created or were created in our societies, and basically to do a checkup to see that we're abiding by the things that were laid forward, and how to keep a good mind, to make sure that we're giving appreciation for everything that we're given, and to lead a good life. And also to check up on the other things that were created in our world in relation to how we interact with the environment. And in this case, some of the bird stories. So when the creator came down this one time, he noticed that the humans had songs, and the humans were singing and enjoying themselves and giving thanks. He also noticed that the birds didn't have songs, and they were silent. And as they watched and he looked around a little more, he noticed that the trees also had songs. And as the wind blew through on their branches, they had songs. The rivers had songs. As the water flowed, they made a noise. But again, he looked at the birds, and the birds had no song. And so he decided to offer the birds a way to get a song or songs amongst the birds. And he called upon the bird leaders to come together and asked the birds. He noticed that there were no songs, and asked them, "Would you like songs?" And of course they said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, with anything in life, we have to work towards, it's not going to be free. You're going to have to work towards it. So we're going to have a competition, and we're going to invite all the species of birds to meet tomorrow morning. We're going to have this competition to see who can fly the highest." And so all the bird leaders said, "Yeah, we'd be interested in that. We will gather tomorrow." And so tomorrow came, and the birds were all lining up, and they put their greatest flyers forward to be part of this competition. And the creator said, "Whoever can fly the highest will get their selection of the first song. And you can have any song you want. And the second one who flies the second highest will have their song, and the third, and so on and so forth." So they agreed. And some of the birds were stretching out, others were pacing around, being nervous. And there were other birds that were in contemplation and rest, and had their eyes closed and just preparing for the journey to see if they can fly the highest. And one of those birds that was taking their collective thought and patience was the eagle. And so the eagle was resting their mind and just preparing for this flight. And there was a smaller bird next to them, and they thought, well, the smaller birds thought to themselves, I'm never going to fly higher than this eagle or condor or whatever birds are here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to nest inside this eagle's head feathers, and I'm going to hide in there, and that's where I'm going to be. And so as the birds begin to fly up higher and higher, the competition starts. And the first one that falls down is the hummingbird. And the hummingbird, if you know the hummingbird sound, it's more of it's a hum. It's wings beating really fast, and that's the sound that it was given. And one by one, the birds begin to fall down, and the larger birds got closer to the sun. And the one that is recognizable is the condor or the vulture, whose head is red and his head feathers were scorched off by the sun. And the one that was just about to pierce the clouds was the eagle. It was the last one, so they thought. And as the eagle fell back and was starting to fall down, like if you've ever seen an eagle come from it, it kind of falls backwards and it fell down. Just at that same point, that little bird was hiding in its neck feathers and went up and went above the clouds. And it was the highest flying bird. And the eagle was upset because as the eagle was falling down, they looked up and they saw this little bird that had cheated by hiding in the neck feathers and came up and went to the highest point. And as the eagle came down, all the other birds were looking up at this smaller bird that came down. And the smaller bird was excited. However, when it came closer to the ground, it had realized by the look on the faces of the other birds that they were angry, they were upset. And when the bird landed, they were all upset. And the creator said, "You flew the highest, but at the same time, you weren't transparent in the way you went about doing your process of getting higher and higher and to win this and to achieve on this song." And the creator did give the bird on this song, and the bird we know today with that song is the hermit thrush. And I'm not sure if they have it in Australia, but if you look up the North American bird, hermit thrush, you'll see and listen to its beautiful song. But it's so ashamed about what it had done and about not being transparent in the way it went about things. And even though it did win the best song, and it was a champion, at the same time, today it hides in the weeds and it only sings as the sun comes up and as the sun goes down. And it's a very solitary bird because it's so ashamed about what had happened and what it had done. And all the other birds were upset with it. So I share that story because it talks about transparency and how we approach things. It talks about how we interact and we work together, or we should work together in the research context and sharing data. That and the process of doing research, that we should remain very transparent on how we go about talking about whether it's research relationships or data use relationships or service or community relationships. That the transparency and bidirectional communication is very important. And although, like the hermit thrush, sometimes shortcuts are taken and a champion is achieved, whether an academic side is by winning a grant or other, there's consequences if it's not in transparent type of fashion. So that story is part of that sharing, as part of that dreaming process of understanding about how we should be working in our communities with a transparent mindset, and the need for equitable data use agreements. So these are just some examples from the US side in that process as we begin to now talk more about the data use agreement side of things. And I call it beyond the IRB because these are legally binding contracts that kind of stipulate terms. And oftentimes when research is done now between either university, the cancer center, and in the US and Canada, we have government to university or government to cancer center relationships. And oftentimes there's multiple legal teams looking at the research beyond the ethical side of it, but putting kind of legal and ethics together so that there's a relationship that's through a binding contract. And these DUAs are sometimes drafted by institutions, universities, organizations, and at times they're often one-sided because if you think about it, if a data user agreement is created by, say, a university that's never worked in the country landscape or with peoples in various parts of the country or territories or reservations, then by proxy they don't really have that understanding of may not have that understanding of cultural nuances in research. And so how do we go about and maybe that's not it's not by it's just maybe not by choice or by education. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think there has to be a bi-directional conversation when you start talking about IRBs or data use agreements, and vice versa too. It's like the tribes or the country landscapes, or New Zealand, the iwis also have conversations, should have bi-directional conversations in the creation of these data user agreements. And the process that we did to create this kind of DUA, and this spawned from a paper that we were writing, and the idea actually spawned during the pandemic, because what we were seeing, not only in our respective landscapes here, but across the world, was the need to conduct research, especially a vaccine-related research during the pandemic, to find something to help our people. But what was happening at the same time is that tribes were either being part of clinical assessments, different tests to test for COVID, and biological samples were being taken either by saliva, by nasal swabs, by blood, and some of those companies also put in their consent forms, the broad consent to use, whether it be biological data or survey data or epi data or clinical intake data for future research. And that was really kind of a stark approach to see that happening in some of our communities, but also on the flip side, because it was an emergency situation, we were put in an area where we had to likely do that to find out if we were going to be sick and what that might mean to our family and our communities. So it was a really hard situation to put many of our nations and our people in that kind of position. But now is the time to talk about that. What happened to that data? What are the protections in this kind of post-pandemic era of that data? Where is it and where is it going? Now is also the time to revisit some of those relationships through data user agreements and reclamation and conversation, bidirectional conversation about what happened, in particular to pandemic and genomic data, and also the data that came from some of the pandemic samples. So we worked with a team of Indigenous attorneys to start this conversation about data use agreements and how to create something that might be beneficial for our peoples and communities. We worked with the attorneys to basically do a systematic review of tribal, university, and federal data user agreements that were in existence. And we adapted those structures through meetings with our attorneys and our community advisory board. And we started to create a process for a template, basically for a data user agreement. We brought that draft back to our advisory board again, reworked it, and then we reworked with Indigenous attorneys based on community advisement and feedback. Then we submitted to our Cancer Center's internal legal team, and we went back through this cycle like 2 times to make sure that one, it had like best practices for data use agreement, that it covered as much as possible. And it also had community advisement on its creation and what that meant to our communities. And also if it was too legalese kind of verbiage to work and exchange that legal language towards more community friendly language. And then once it was approved on our end, we began using that in our projects moving forward. And we also gifted it to other tribal nations, Indigenous nations. We gifted it to the National Institute of Health, Tribal Health Research Office. And we made it, we didn't copyright it or anything of that nature. We made it for public domain use. Because again, if you go back to the beginning when I shared about how we work, we're taught to work amongst each other and with our nations collectively, that this is something that, is for the use of all people and for the protection of data and communities, indigenous communities around the world. And it lays that framework of both working together, sharing and protection, and it creates a really good bidirectional conversation with either parliament, other government structures, and other tribes as well. And this is an article that we published that kind of led up to the data user agreement. And it's based on more empowering and equitable data use partnerships around data sovereignty amid pandemic genomics. And this really was, based on the conversation that I just shared that led about what was happening during the pandemic and where we're at today. And in between there is where we created the data use agreement and how to put that into action. These are just some of the questions that we had too, then and now. And I shared a few of them. Where is the data housed? Whose data is it? Protections against commercialization. Did companies keep those biosamples? For example, when we mailed samples to external labs, where are they? And where's that data that came from them? And how are universities managing pandemic data with tribes? So I think a lot of these questions are still, they make good research questions too, by the way. Each one of these could be its own research project, but it's important, and it's an important conversation to have about what happened during the pandemic, which really leads to the importance of creating and empowering communities to really work through one, creating their own research protocols, but also to engage with their legal team or hiring a legal team to represent areas in regards to data use agreements. And these are just a few samples of the recitals that are in the data user agreement. What is a potential long-term benefit for facilitating, this type of work towards the community members and in relation to healthcare and disease management? Expectations of the data and the tribe and the research partners' use of that data. Here I note again some language around the transparency around the use of data, engaging in research, the protections and security of that data, and also minimum requirements for partners that are in charge of that data, for example. Data use conditions and obligations. And we hear many of these. If you've worked in the area of kind of Indigenous data sovereignty or Indigenous data protocol or Indigenous data tribal research protocols, you'll see a lot of these kind of nuances put in, discussed about what we should and what should happen during a research project. But when it comes to actually implementing and putting a contract or a legal contract behind it, it then becomes a legally binding situation between whether it be a tribal government or a country area that has perhaps a not-for-profit type organization that has that works within the community to work with health data. And part of that also, when you look towards the end of it, is the dissemination of those final reports back to the community and how the data is used going forward, whether it be in conferences or manuscripts or publications. Those are all really important pieces of data user agreements. Highlight some more areas that are in the data use agreement. Data ownership. Is it going to be sole ownership of the region or area or tribe or governance? Data access. Who has data, and how do you come about using that data going forward? Data protection. Who's responsible for the collection and analysis and responsibility of that data? Data storage. Who will house both the physical and electronic data, because like in some of the cases, if you think about the pandemic data, and it is physical and electronic because it's recorded somewhere. Even though the physical data may have been destroyed, the electronic data still exists about our people, and where is that being stored and who's in charge of that. dissemination plan again. And I think it's really important too, a community-specific report, a report that can be put in community terms and shared back to the community about a particular project or what's happening with the data to keep the community informed. Publications and damages. Again, these are really you don't often see this language in a research protocol. This would be in agreements between the organization, the university, the cancer center, and the tribe or country area. Damages, who's held harmless for it. Joint venture, are you going to allow a joint venture of any findings or things that lead to something that is profitable? Are you going to create joint ventures? Who has the potential to do that? Dispute resolution. Or many tribes in the U.S. side have a sovereign immunity from unconsented lawsuits, so that's important to understand too. What type of conflict resolution or dispute resolution is part of that research process, and who has jurisdiction? Is it the federal? Is it the parliament? Is it the state court? Who has jurisdiction over Indigenous data? And these are things that we would include in a study protocol, tribal resolution, project scope and parameters, as part of a data user agreement and part of the exhibits, which are basically attachments to a data user agreement. And then getting towards the end here, I also talk about restoring our good mind. And so the Haudenosaunee philosophy is part of that. When we talked about in the very beginning about finding peace towards strength, towards resolution amongst each other, and how do we maintain that conversation of thought in the things that we do. And part of that is based in engaging peace so others can see yourself, reclaiming yourself, family, and readiness to action change. And I put action change in there too, because DOAs are part of that. Data user agreements are part of that. Building respectful tribal protocols and conversations are part of that. And these conversations are great to have. And it's great that we're building these tools to use, where it's great that we're having conversations on Indigenous data sovereignty. But now's the time to put that into action, to take that DOA, to take that information and to use it. We've been using that with our projects that now and in the past few projects in the past year or so. And there have been bits and pieces from the DOA that fit, and there have been bits and pieces that do not fit. So each situation is a little different, but the conversation and having that available for your partner to have that conversation is probably the most actionable item you can do. What we're talking about here in a lecture or presentation is great, but it's really when you put it in action and make change within that community to protect data for future generations and the things that we do is where, that's the aim of what we're doing here. And finally, it's really about in our Haudenosaunee philosophies, we have a seventh generation kind of concept in what we do, meaning that the things that we do now and today, like me sharing this project out and this document about data and conversation on data user agreements is part of the here and now, but it's really about 7 generations forward, that we have to think ahead 7 generations forward in order to make change, to protect, to understand, to provide research, to provide service back to our communities 7 generations forward, so that the health and wellness of our youth, our children, our future generations are intact, and that it's our responsibility. It was our ancestors' responsibility to bring us up to where we're at today, but it's our responsibility to carry that forward, thinking ahead 7 generations. And data user agreements are part of that, needed to protect the interplay of both Indigenous knowledge and Western sciences. Looking beyond the US to more global knowledge are important practices. So my appreciation for the invitation to share here, and also keeping an open mind on how these DOAs can translate to other communities beyond Australia and in Australia, across the country. And lastly, building a sustainable DOA plan for benefits for the next 7 generations. These are my 2 daughters here on the screen as well. And they're the ones that really provide me that kind of, you know, reflection about, why am I doing this? Oh yes, it's because of them. It's because of their children. It's because of their children's children, and so on and so forth. In summary, the teamwork that this conversation is hopes to bring forward to create a strategic and sustainable DUA with what we would say as a good mind, or Indigenous knowledge that looks forward 7 generations, is reflective of the true wampum between, this is one of the wampum agreements we have between countries, that shares that we each have our own kind of sovereign approach, separate from other countries or other nations, and that we traveled on this river of life together, in harmony, not to tip each other's canoe, so to say, but to respect each other's governance, process, understandings, language, culture, traditions, and what that means to the health of our people, and to embrace and expand and explore ways to incorporate the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And that goes into, having a voice, into sovereignty movements. I believe that the Aboriginal people of Australia are in the process of, talking about amendments, to Parliament to have a voice. It would be great to include some of this work here into that voice as an amendment in regards to how Indigenous data is used for the health of, 7 generations forward. And a few acknowledgements. So with that, I thank you for your time. I believe there may be a few questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Rodney, thank you so much for sharing that. It's a fascinating subject and a really excellent presentation. Thank you. I loved the Haudenosaunee story of how the birds got their songs, and I will definitely be looking up the song of the hermit thrush as soon as we're off this call. I also, the way that story spoke to, you know, the importance of transparency and then enshrining that within the agreement, within the DUA was great. So there are a few questions online. I'm interested. So, I mean, you've mentioned that with the DUA template, there's been bits and pieces when you're sort of, you know, using it in anger as such. When you're trying to practice it, some elements of it fit and some elements don't in the context of the specific research agreement. How has the template been received by researchers or commercial entities interested in engaging with the tribes?
I think I think that the conversations have initiated to some extent. Often, I think it's getting more and more because now NIH is requiring that. Commercial kind of use of data is probably a whole separate conversation and a presentation. But I think that just having something in place where you can say, here's something that was created, other people have been using it. Are there bits and pieces that are, relevant to our situation here or where we want to go? I think it's more, I don't think this is a end all be all, but I think it's a place to start conversations. And it has been for us, with tribes, with other universities that are like, we don't have anything like that. I'm like, well, here, take this. You can use it. That's what it's for. I mean, that's exactly what it's for. It's for the conversation and with the hopes of being, used in the right way.
Mm. All right, I better get to some of these questions because they keep on coming in. So Louise, thanks you for a wonderful and insightful presentation and for sharing the beautiful creation story. She goes on to ask, in these agreements, are individual participant and tribe one and the same, particularly around intellectual property and data ownership? So she's thinking of Indigenous participants who engage in research outside of a tribal affiliation.
Yeah, that's a good point because, in the US too, there has been, conversations about what are the, governance protections about, Indigenous people that live in urban context, or, they come into a facility and they're courted for research, and a research sample is taken, for example. What does that mean? What does that mean to that particular tribe? They may have a residence on a territory, a reservation, or area of the country, but they're off territory protected governance. And what does that mean? So I think that's conversations that are probably, they are happening here in the US about Indigenous data. But my counter to that would be, you know, incorporate, if you're going to work in a part of a country that has an Indigenous urban area, a not-for-profit or leadership that's off government structures, incorporate them into the research project and have them be your governing partner. They may not have the same ability and authority as a tribal government, but they do have community authority and they do have a strong voice for the people. So work with the Indigenous organizations board of directors. They may assign a liaison to work with the project, but I think it's really important to have that urban structure or off governance structure to be part of it. The other thing too is to create a community advisory board of leadership from the different parts of the country to be part of projects to provide community oversight. And again, may not have governance structure, but they have a strong voice of the people.
Excellent. All right, thank you. So Ben asks where one might find the DUA that you refer to if it's in the public domain. Is that on your organization's website?
No, we eventually will put it there, but I will give it to Tiffany, and then you can share it out as you please. You're free to put it on your website too. We made it in that way that it's open source, that we share it out. I've been to conferences where I bring them on little jump drives and I give them out to all the participants.
Yeah,
And
that'd be
some of the
wonderful.
articles. Yeah, but I'll definitely share it, and you can share it out as you please.
Thank you, Rodney. That'd be terrific. I'm very keen to see it now. Angeline, thanks you for a wonderful presentation, inspiring presentation. Di asks, from the legal perspective, do you ever get any questions about whether data can be owned as such?
That's also a good question. And I think, who owns anything, right? I mean, that's a very philosophical question, I think. But I think like, you know, um, to have a voice in the ownership, so to say, of something is really important. Especially around like biologicals, right? I mean, some indigenous communities, for example, ours, we're when we leave to the next world, we are told to bring everything with us. So if we have a biological sample that's shared out, we should have the right to have it back so we can bury it with it. Culturally, that's appropriate. And so when a project is finished and there's data and there's intellectual property to that, you know, who owns that and what is done with it. And so I think those conversations are really important to have at the forefront and continuous over time about what that means. And I say continuous because I've seen over different government entities or structures and tribal side and parliament or in our case, the state or federal, that the administration changes and that sometimes the knowledge that that administration had is no longer there. And so it has to be a sustainable, continual relationship. And that process of data ownership conversation needs to happen because there's different ways to approach that over time. 5 years ago, the conversation would have been vastly different than it is today. So it has to be a continuous relationship and communication.
That actually speaks to another question that Ben has. So you have the DUA as the legal framework, and he asked, is anyone building a computational framework in parallel to manage or control access to data sets to provide sort of structure to the legal agreement?
There's probably many, and I think that in the era of big data, like I don't know, I think it's happening globally. There's a lot of machine learning, machine technology, big data computational techniques. Now is the time to have this conversation. Now is the time to put it in place. Now is the time to create with unique approaches beyond social sciences, beyond medical sciences, but we need to work with our engineers, our data people, all these different walks of life to create protections, to create models that are protecting our data, understanding our data from an Indigenous perspective. And it isn't just about us or myself as like the work that I do. It's really about this diverse array of knowledges and talents that need to come together to create things like the participant had asked about. Now's the time to inquire. And if you're a student or you're a faculty, that'd be a great project to put forward to create something of that nature. And that would be a win for future generations too.
So really the importance of bringing that multidisciplinary effort to progress this. Okay, so Beck thanks you for an interesting talk and asks whether you've had any experiences in enforcing any of the clauses in this DUA yet. How are you expecting knowledge of breaches to come to light?
Also a good question. Yes, I think. I don't know if it was forced, but it's like, you know how when you're like, you want to keep saying, well, that's not, we should include that. You know, that's really important to our people, you know, and to really frame that, whether it be for here in the US, we have like treaties between our nations with the United States, and to emphasize that was agreed in this historical treaty, for example, or, you know, it was language from our ancestors that are, it's guiding this process. So it's really important to bring that forward, and I wouldn't say force, but I would say to be respectfully persistent in the way you approach the conversations, and not to give up, like not to you know, there will be some compromises along the pathway, but the importance is really a protection of our people, and it's about educating people too, so they may not understand exactly why that's in there. And it's our role to be an educator. I'm not an attorney, but I know the importance of certain clauses and what that means to our people. And another approach that we've taken through our cancer center is to hire outside Indigenous counsel or attorneys or legal to support the conversation about what that means in in the legal framework to our people. Because remember, I was talking about sometimes these data user agreements have one voice and one thought into it, and they come from, say, a university. And they don't have any knowledge of the history or the legal nuances of Indigenous legal terms or what it means culturally. So it's really kind of braiding or weaving that conversation from different perspectives.
Excellent. I love that, the phrase, sort of braving and weaving it into. Okay, we have a question from Justine, which is along the same lines as Louise's question. How do we apply concepts of DUAs when Indigenous participants' data has been collected historically and stored in existing biobanks?
What I would do is enter into conversations about that with whoever's holding it, to be respectfully persistent, to understand what they are going to do with it, what you know, how can they interact with tribal people, to make the communities aware of what's there, and their reaction to that, and how they can be part of that process. It's all about education and awareness, really. You know, most academic institutions, if they are near or adjacent Indigenous populations, especially if they have a hospital, there's likely some sort of data there in one form or another. And I also want to bring up the conversation, and again, probably another presentation about clinical data versus research data. So hospitals have clinical data that are for service, but it's not intended for research, but they still may hold it in a parallel kind of repository, a clinical repository, not intended for research. Does that need a protection clause around it? I don't know, maybe. But if it's fully research intended, there should be some conversations around what that means to the communities in their particular landscape.
certainly that question around clinical versus research data sets, particularly in genomics, when there is such a relationship between the two, sort of clinical activity and research activity is a challenging one to unpick. So Matilda Hayes asks a question that I was also wondering myself. So you mentioned that members of the tribes participated in COVID research because original research was important, but as a trade-off had to agree at the time to future data use. Have there been examples where participants in this research have later been empowered, perhaps by the communities or their leaders, to exercise their rights to withdraw their data from future use?
That's our hope, and I haven't seen it happen yet. And I don't know, I haven't heard of any cases of that yet. But I think conversations like this and sharing that article, and that article was written really during the pandemic, and like just at the era of like when the pandemic was like kind of slowing down. And we just saw that happening in a lot of our communities across the country, across the world. And I was on the COVID-19 task force on looking at nuances of vaccine development globally. And specifically, my role with a few others were to look at those protections and understanding about what that COVID-19 data meant, or how the research trials were unfolding. So we had a voice there, and we did say like, hey, you should really think about these data use protections, or you need tribal approval if you're going to do any kind of vaccine research in our different communities. So that was part of the recommendations that we made post-COVID. I don't know. I'm hoping that tribes will, and it's usually, a tribe has the most strength to make that case or conversation. If a tribe said, we would like our data back, or we would like to create a data user agreement. We know you have all these genomic data on our people. We would like to make a data user agreement and how you intend to use that and how we can be involved. So the whole point of this conversation is that, to put it in action, whether it be pre or post.
Excellent. Oh, look, I am conscious of time. I'm sorry to others who've answered questions, but we're going to have to say goodbye to Rodney now. Look, thank you so much. It was such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation, and I would be most grateful if you would share that agreement with us, with me, and I can on-share along with your article. It's been really lovely having this conversation with you today.
My honor and my pleasure. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rodney. So our next DNA Dialogue seminar will be held on the 28th of September, and it will feature Segun Fatumo, who leads the African Computational Genomics Research Group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So I hope you can all join me for that presentation too. Thanks so much for today. Bye-bye.